All right, welcome back. So this section is all about customizing Bootstrap. How do we change the default colors so that primary and secondary and info and success aren't just those standard colors that we see on everywhere on Bootstrap? How do we change it so it works with our own company color palette? There's other things we can customize as well, but we're starting with colors. And to do this, we need to work with the Bootstrap SASS files. And if you're not familiar with SASS, this isn't a course on SASS, but it is what's known as a CSS preprocessor. It is a tool that lets you write certain shortcuts. You can add things like variables into your CSS, which is not valid regular CSS. And then you basically hit compile, and it spits out the equivalent style sheet, which is usually a lot longer and uglier. So they call it CSS with superpowers. So with Bootstrap, if you think of how many times the primary value it would be in the source code, if we think of any class that has primary, so we have primary button, primary text, BG primary, there's many, many more. Each one of those has a reference to a color. And if we wanted to change that in regular CSS, I would have to go through every single one and replace the color. But with SASS, I can update a single variable and it will update in multiple places. So if you take a look, again, this is not a course on SASS, but we can do things like this. Make a primary color variable or a variable they call font stack and use it in your code. But then when it compiles to CSS, when it spits out the CSS file, it replaces those values correctly, putting the font or putting the color where it belongs. We can also write nicer selectors where we can nest selectors. So this here is styling all ULs inside of nav elements. And what we actually get at the end of the day looks like this, where you have the CSS that is spit out at the end, but you can write it with a shorter syntax. So this is saying all ULs in a nav, all LIs in a nav, and all anchor tags in a nav. And otherwise, if we were writing this on our own, it's not that much more work, but we would have to, manually make sure we do nav space li, nav space anchor tag. So that's a super quick intro to SASS. The problem with SASS is that it can be a pain to actually install and get it up and running on your computer, depending on, on a lot of things. Most people use different build tools, usually centered around the command line or the terminal, and I don't want to be dependent on that for this course. So we're using a tool called Koala, which is free. It runs on all platforms, and it's a visual tool that you actually point to your SASS file, and you say, compile this. Or you can tell it to auto-compile and just watch it, so that anytime you write code in there, it will spit out the correct CSS, the equivalent CSS, based off of your SASS. So go ahead and download this if you want to follow along. And I'm going to show you a really quick demonstration of SASS in this video with Koala without Bootstrap. So I'm going to make my own CSS file and compile it to CSS. Okay, so I have an empty folder, and in this empty folder, I'm going to make a new file, save it as index.html, and I'm not even going to touch that HTML file for now. What I'm going to do next is make a new file that ends in .scss. So I'll call this demo.scss. And in here, I'm going to write SASS code. So one thing I could do is make a variable. I could say bg color is, and then give some color value like let's pick one, and then I'll give it a color value like maybe this, and then I can use that to style things. I can say body background is $bg color. Now this would be easy to do by just putting the color there, but imagine I'm using this all over the place in a really long style sheet, like thousands of selectors. And I'll also say maybe something nested like this. Let's say inside of a nav, if I ever have an li, style those anchor tags inside of li's, inside of navs, by giving them backgrounds of purple. Okay, so super simple, but this is SASS. And if I just tried to use this as CSS, it's not valid. It's not going to know what the heck I'm talking about here, or what this is, or what this is. We can't do this nested syntax. So I'm going to save. What we need to do now is compile it into the correct CSS. So I'm going to use Koala. So here's Koala, and I'm going to add this or click this plus sign, and then point it to the folder that I'm working in, which is, what did I call it? SASS demo. This folder right here, where I can see my SCSS file. And you'll actually see automatically I have a new file here called demo.css. So the default that it will do is take your code and your SCSS files and compile them into a file of the same name, but as CSS. So if we look at this, we now have, okay, so actually it's a lot shorter, but you can see it's compiled where it took that color and plugged it into the correct spot. And then it took this nested selector and turned it into this style selector, which is the same exact thing. Now, if I made this a little more complicated and I said navs have a background of yellow and font size of 20 pixels, LIs inside of navs have a background of green. Now you can see we get some more complicated markup that's generated, but it's taking our SASS and turning it into CSS. So one thing worth noting with Koala, if you did want to change this file name or the location of this file, we can do that. If you right click on it, you can change the output path. So if I didn't want demo.scss, if I wanted to make a new folder called compiled CSS, and then I want the file, the CSS output file itself to be called final.css, I could do that. And now, anytime I make changes to demo SCSS, what else could I do? Let's add in anchor tags, background purple, font size 40 pixels, massive. Now you can see demo.css is not updating anymore. They're not really connected, so I can delete that. But if I look in compiled CSS, my new file is updating and it has that font size in there. So this is the basic workflow we'll follow with Bootstrap. The only difference is we're going to take the raw Bootstrap, if you will, the SASS. We're going to compile it into a single file at the end. But before we do that, we can change certain values, change the variables. So they use variables in their code, and I'll show you that in the next video, how we can actually change those values, change primary, secondary, that sort of thing, and then spit out a file, and then include that file in our code. So that's next.